I guess it's not against the rules to start a few minutes early. Has anyone watched kind of I want to say this is almost a self-made documentary about a lawyer who began to investigate the Star of Bethlehem? And so it's just simply called the Star of Bethlehem. And so this lawyer is an amateur astronomer, and he wound up purchasing some astronomy software. I think it's called Night Sky, because you really can predict the movement of the stars. And in fact, the fellow who discovered the laws of planetary motion, a Lutheran fellow, Johannes Kepler, although he was excommunicated because he didn't believe in the real presence, but that's okay, we'll forgive him. But one of the things that Kepler did, he studied under the famous astronomer Tycho Brahe. And so what Kepler did, once he discovered the laws of planetary motion, is he ran the equations backwards, looking for the star of Bethlehem. And I have to confess, I do not recall what the date that he picked out. So anyway, this fellow, this lawyer who purchased now this software of astronomy, he did the same thing. You can run it backwards in time to see where the position of the stars are at. And you have to kind of make there's some disagreement about the Star of Bethlehem, whether it was a natural or a supernatural phenomenon. He's going to fall down into the camp that it was a natural phenomenon. And so he does all of his biblical research and whatnot, but he came out with that the actual day that corresponds to the Good Friday is April the 10th. It was really neat in that the very first year that I saw this documentary, one of my teachers at the school I was at, her husband was just fascinated by this, and he bought this thing and he made me sit down and watch it. And the cool thing for that year is that Good Friday did happen to be on April the 10th. So it was kind of a neat, well, I worked it into my sermon. I had to, but I was just curious. If you've never seen it, I think it's pretty much called the Star of Bethlehem. You can just, if you Google it, eventually it'll pop up, I think.
Relation between the Star of Bethlehem and Good Friday? Biggest Star of Bethlehem as Christ's birthday,
Yes.
but not Good Friday.
You are correct. But again, you can then, once you establish when the star was, you can run the calculations and find out, again, you can find out other astronomical signs that point to April the 10th being Good Friday. I know it's a little bit of a disconnect, but again, if it's a natural wonder, because he's assuming then if the star was a natural wonder, then the darkness was a natural wonder on Good Friday, and there was a full solar eclipse. When
That sort of diminishes God. Because that's kind of an ordinary thing. Well, rare, but still ordinary. We predict those things.
Ruth, I was in the same camp until you realize that in order for that to be true, again, because of the laws of planetary motion, that would have already have been set in motion on day, was it day 4 of creation, where God made the sun and the moon and all the stars, and you're like, oh. It was already planned. It was already there. Either way, again, it doesn't solve the debate if it was natural or supernatural, but
Supernatural was planned that I have too, so there you go.
Indeed.
The argument against supernatural, there's nothing out there that's really recorded. If it was something supernatural, surely there would have been some more references to it. And when the way Matthew has it, when the wise men, they saw his star in the east.
Right.
Implying probably a bit of astrology of the whole thing anyway. And the Jews were into astrology too, in terms of assigning, the sign of Judah was the constellation of Leo, the lion.
Right.
And that comes, some information about, in the Bible, it calls Judah the lion.
Yeah.
The star was probably something, it could have been like the moon in the I haven't studied it in detail, but, the conjunction of Leo and some star. If it had been something spectacular or whatever and all that,
he made a very compelling argument that using strictly astronomy, that it was a natural event.
If it had been something supernatural, someone else would have picked it up too. It wasn't just visible to a couple of people.
And it's true, but but also, even if they did, we may not have found it yet. Of all of the sciences that we use to, I guess, fact check the Bible, archaeology is the youngest of all of those. And so they really have only excavated less than 5% of the stuff back in the Middle East that there is to excavate. And already there's such enormous corroboration of the scriptural things. But, all right.
If one thinks of a miracle, as to Ruth's point, as something that occurs that would not occur in the normal course of nature, then God does use a lot of ordinary means to accomplish things. I mean, the resurrection of Jesus would be
Sure. It defies the laws of nature. But again, for this to have been a natural phenomenon, God would have had to set it up the day he created that particular law of nature. All right. I'll get to my point for bringing that up here in a little bit. So we are on Nehemiah chapter 8, beginning at verse 13. On the second day, the heads of fathers' houses of all the people, with the priests and the Levites, came together to Ezra the scribe in order to study the words of the law. And they found it written in the law that the Lord had commanded by Moses that the people of Israel should dwell in booths during the feast of the 7th month, and that they should proclaim it and publish it in all their towns and in Jerusalem. Go out into the hills and bring branches of olive, wild olive, myrtle, palm, and other leafy trees to make booths as it is written. So the people went out and brought them and made booths for themselves, each on his roof, and in their courts, and in the courts of the house of God, and in the square at the water gate, and in the square, made booths and lived in the booths. For from the days of Yeshua, the son of Nun, to that day, the people of Israel had not done so, and there was very great rejoicing. And day by day, from the first day to the last day, he read from the book of the law of God. They kept the feast 7 days, and on the 8th day there was a solemn assembly according to the rule. All right. At the risk of this being the last Bible class you all ever let me teach, I'm going to tell a story on why this passage is the poster child for having screens in church. So I was preaching on the Feast of Booths, all right, one Sunday morning, and I get done with the early service, and I have a parishioner says, "Pastor, I'm sure glad we had the screens today, because when you first said the name booths, I thought you meant booze, B-O-O-Z-E, the festival of booze." And I'm like, oh, well, that doesn't sound so bad. After the late service, another parishioner, a gal, stops me and says, one who was quite comfortable with me, stops me and says, "Pastor, I'm sure glad we had the screens." And I'm like, wow, same compliment, same observation, just one service later. Because when you first said the festival of booths, I thought you said the festival of boobs, B-O-O-B-S. And I'm like, yep. But now, I couldn't help but thinking, because my elders were always looking to me to find the answers to why attendance was decreasing. And I'm like, well, if we have a festival of booze and a festival of boobs, we can probably get a lot more people to come. But I never shared that thought publicly.
You're pronouncing it pretty true.
Ever since that day, I do my best to over-enunciate, because that's just not a word that we say in English very often. All right. So where does the history of the observance of booths come from? What are they remembering? The wandering in the wilderness. All right. So they're remembering the temporariness, if you will, of that time. that even the tabernacle where they would worship and keep the Ark of the Covenant, even that was mobile. If you really want a fascinating study, you can look at during the times of the wilderness, the tribes would be assigned a job, if you will, when it came to packing up the tabernacle, lugging it to the new location, and then setting it back up. If you've ever been a part of a new church plant and had to worship in a building where you had to set up tables and chairs every Sunday, and folks will complain that gets kind of old after a while. This was 40 years of some very elaborate setting up and tearing down. But what is the significance of this festival, of reminding the people of this temporariness, of this calling them to live in a booth or a tabernacle, if you will? Because the timing of this festival, and that's kind of why I brought up the story of the star, is that you can tell that as they're reading the book of the law through Ezra, the light bulb comes on that says, oh, hey, wait a minute, that's right now. Okay? The timing was pretty, well, it has to be a God thing, right? And so they realize that either the festival is coming up very soon or it started or whatnot, and they go and they make their temporary shelters and they dwell in them. By the way, when I preached on this, I had the children's message. I was truly inspired. I thought of it just before worship started, and I asked anyone in the congregation that had a blanket in their car to go get the blanket. And so I got like a dozen blankets out of, 100 people who were gathered. And as the kids came up, we made little forts up in the altar area. And you've noticed that I'm not the most formal of pastor types. So I'm looking around and what I can use to make a fort. And my eyes happen to fall on the processional cross. Yes. See that person back there shaking their head like you wouldn't dare chuck a blanket on that and use it as a tent pole. Yes, I did. I got to tell you, I was really gifted at annoying some of my more formal worshipy type people. That was a great children's message, because then you could stretch them out over the communion rail and all the kids could duck inside. Perfect for describing a booth or a temporary tabernacle. So the timing of this festival, this observance, is unique because during this particular month, the seventh month of the year, actually earlier in that month, you had the highest of the Jewish remembrances, and that is the Day of Atonement. All right. Remember, on the Day of Atonement, that is the one day a year where the high priest will go into the Holy of Holies. All right. And they sacrifice. They have two goats, right? They sacrifice one, and they'll sprinkle the blood on that one of that sacrifice goat. They'll sprinkle that on the people. What do they do with the other goat? they exile it to the wilderness. That becomes the scapegoat. If you've ever wondered where that term comes from, it takes the sins of the community and is exiled, takes them far away. As far as the east is from the west, so far do I remove your transgressions from you. So they scapegoat the sins of the people, and they sprinkle the blood. And this was such the high point, if you will, in the Jewish calendar. One of my favorite things is that they would tie a rope onto the ankle of the high priest in case he keeled over dead while he was in the. It's not in the Holy of Holies, right? Because there is that time as Joshua is leading the people into the promised land, right? God parts the Jordan River, and they're walking along, and the ark begins to tip over. And what happens? A couple of the Jewish guys put their hands on it to steady it, and they do what? They fall over dead. And so when the ark was captured by the Philistines, they eventually brought it back. They gave it back to the Jews because it was causing such mischief, right? All of their gods and their temple where they brought it began to fall over, and there was just earthquakes and loss of crops and milk going sour and whatnot, and they gave it back. They said, get this thing out of here. And so it's not unheard of to say that you needed to be careful with the Ark of the Covenant. So they would tie a rope on the ankle of the high priest in case he died while he was in there, so they could drag him out without having to go in there, because only the high priest could go in there, and only during the Day of Atonement. And so you have this pinnacle, this highlight, if you will, in the Jewish worship calendar. And then just a few weeks after that, you have, okay, now go dwell in a fort. You know, go build a fort like your kids did when they were little, and go dwell in that. And while it is remarkably fun for young ones, I have to say, as I tried to crawl underneath the blankets and into the fort, as a 40-year-old guy, it was less fun. But the purpose, why did God have his people dwell in these temporary shelters? To remind us that our life here on this earth is what? Temporary. This is not our home, right? Heaven is our fatherland. Sorry, we sang that hymn at 500 funerals that I've done. That's okay, though. We're not doing it at my funeral. But if you want it at yours, that's quite all right. Just write it down. And where do you find Jesus in the Festival of Booths? No, that was Day of Atonement, was the scapegoat. This is the Festival of Booths. Where do you find Jesus? Gospel of John, chapter 1. Nope. John chapter 1. Let's see if I can find it quick. The true light, which enlightens everyone, was coming into the world. He was in the world, and the world was made through him, yet the world did not know him. He came to his own, and his own people did not receive him. But to all who did receive him and who believed in his name, he gave the right to become children of God, who were born not of blood, nor of the will of the flesh, nor of the will of man, but of God. And the Word became flesh and dwelt among us, and we have seen his glory, glory as the only Son from the Father, full of grace and truth. And so the Greek word, when he came and dwelt among us, is tabernacled. He came and tabernacled among us. He spent a little bit of time in this wilderness of a sinful and broken world. And then he went to prepare our home. And also, you have to love God's sense of humor, right? Because these folks have just been exiled. Think of it when you've gone on a long vacation, and even though long vacations are wonderful, sometimes you just want to get back to what? Your own home, your own bed, your own space, your own routine. Yes, these folks were exiled for 70 years, and they come back and they reestablish their home, and what does God make them do? Go dwell in a tent. Go make a hut of sticks and dwell there for a week. I thought it was funny.
But also been a reminder of the time that they did spend traveling in the wilderness.
Yes.
Got to the promised land.
Yes. Yep. And that's the whole thing. That, it serves multiple purposes. It reminds them, of what they had to endure as God set them free from the Egyptians. It reminds them that this earth, this world as we know it, is not our home. In essence, we are tabernacling. We're living in this booth, this tent of a body, right? What does the Apostle Paul say? That these tents that we have of a body will wear out, and he longed to be at home with God as opposed to dwelling in this tent of a body. It's the same word. It's tabernacle, booth, if you will. Theology is just, I should say that word is just filled with theological meaning and implications. But notice when they began to disregard this festival, right? For from the days of Joshua the son of Nun to that day, the people of Israel had not done so. What's inconvenient about dwelling in a booth in September? Because that's when this is. It is getting cooler, right? But there are going to be some of the crops that you planted that this could be around harvest time, right? Yeah. So, I know, remarkable, God asks us to do something that is not so convenient. And for the sake of convenience, what do people then do? Tend to ignore those commands of God. Certainly an Old Testament problem. Never in the New Testament or the modern church do we see folks, for the sake of convenience, ignoring the commands that God has placed upon us. All right. Plus, what a great way to get the kids excited about churchy stuff. That had to be awesome for a kid, I would think. Build a fort, go live in that for a week. All right. And I believe that this is one of the festivals that they were celebrating when Jesus was at the temple. Or maybe it was maybe it was the Festival of Lights, not the Festival of... this is just a thought that is tickling my brain, and I probably should have just kept my mouth shut, because I'm not sure if we have an example of Jesus celebrating this festival, or if they called it a different name by that point in time. All right, I'm sorry, I have to look it up now. I can't just let it go.
Jesus came and lived on earth. They had kind of, some of their practices had changed as far as worship, haven't they? Did they really get to kill animals? Well, I guess they did. Yeah, they did that. They still did.
He was in the
But it
temple.
seemed like it had kind of modified somewhat. So he was there when he was circumcised.
When he was in the temple,
No.
12, it was a Passover.
The 40 day.
What about when he was 12?
Well, when he was 12, he was there. We don't know. His-
That was a feast of the Passover.
And 12 years was
Yeah, it's
Passover.
It's Luke chapter 2.
Was there any reference in the New Testament about them building booths?
Somewhere though, I think there is a reference in one of the Gospels, that he was in Jerusalem at the time of the booths.
Yeah, sometimes they called it Sukkot, S-U-K-K-O-T. John chapter 7. I was just at John. I have to go back.
Feast of Tabernacles, it is mentioned in verse 2.
I think that was another name.
The ESV calls it the Feast of Booths in chapter 7.
Yeah.
Disciples,
Yeah, now the Jews' Feast of Booths was at hand.
Jesus' brothers said to Jesus, he wasn't going to go to Jerusalem. They said, no, you want to be known as the coming Messiah. If you claim to be the Messiah, you should go to Jerusalem and celebrate this so that everyone would know that, yes. There is a connection there.
And yeah, verse 14, about the middle of the feast, Jesus went up into the temple and began teaching. The Jews therefore marveled, saying, "How is it that this man has learning when he has never studied?" If they were celebrating the feast, I would imagine that you'd have some of them at least were living in tents or in booths. All right. Thanks for indulging my curiosity rabbit hole. All right, chapter 9. Now on the 24th day of this month, the people of Israel were assembled with fasting and in sackcloth and with earth on their heads. And the Israelites separated themselves from all foreigners and stood and confessed their sins and the iniquities of their fathers. And they stood up in their place and read from the book of the law of the Lord their God for a quarter of the day. For another quarter of it they made confession and worshiped the Lord their God. On the stairs of the Levites stood Jeshua, Bani, Kadmiel, Shebaniah. I'm going to say Bunny just because. Sherebiah, another Bani, and Chenani, and they cried with a loud voice to the Lord their God. Then the Levites, Yeshua, Kadmiel, Bani, Hashabaniah, Sherebiah, Hodiah, Shebaniah, and Pethahiah said, "Stand up and bless the Lord your God from everlasting to everlasting. Blessed be your glorious name, which is exalted above all blessing and praise. You are the Lord, you alone. You have made heaven, the heavens of heavens, with all their host, the earth and all that is on it, the seas and all that is in them. And you preserve all men, and the host of heaven worships you. You are the Lord, the God who chose Abram, and who brought him out of Ur to the Chaldeans, and gave him the name Abraham. You found his heart faithful before you, and you made with him the covenant to give to his offspring the land of the Canaanite, the Hittite, the Amorite, the Perizzite, the Jebusite, and the Girgashite. And you have kept your promise, for you are righteous. And you saw the affliction of our fathers in Egypt, and heard their cry at the Red Sea, and performed signs and wonders against Pharaoh and all his servants and all the people of his land. For you knew that they acted arrogantly against our fathers. And you made a name for yourself, as it is to this day. And you divided the sea before them, so that they went through the midst of the sea on dry ground. And you cast their pursuers into the depths, as a stone into mighty waters. By a pillar of cloud you led them in the day, and by a pillar of fire in the night, to light for them the way in which they should go. You came down on Mount Sinai, and spoke with them from heaven, and gave them right rules and true laws, good statutes and commandments. And you made known to them your Sabbath, and commanded them commandments and statutes and a law by Moses your servant. You gave them bread from heaven for their hunger. You brought water for them out of the rock for their thirst. And you told them to go in to possess the land that you had sworn to give them. All right. So why the separation? Why did they separate themselves from all the foreigners?
Originally, doesn't it go back to the point in Exodus where they told back to?
Yes.
But not to mix with anyone else.
Right. So again, this is part of the uncomfortable section of the Old Testament, because when God commanded them to go into the land, right? The land was already occupied. The Canaanite, the Hittite, the Amorite, the Perizzite, the Jebusite, and the Girgashite. So there are people already occupying the land, and God's command to his people, Israel, was to do what? Get rid of them all, even the livestock. Gone. And so what word do we call that today? We call that genocide, right? He's commanding a genocide. And critics will point to that and say, that's not such a loving thing there, God, to order a genocide. And there are many Christians who will feel the same way. Okay, I mean, even the women, the children, the infants, and the answer is yes, all of them. Even the animals, and the answer was yes, all of it. But what did they do instead? They
Accepted them and saw that the native people, their crops were being harvested, and they would think that would be a sign of God's blessing. And maybe their crops were even better. So, there must be something wrong with our God. It's not as good as their God, so we should start worshiping them.
Sorry, even during the conquest, recorded there, during the conquest, they actually would ally with a couple of these city-states in order to beat other city-states.
yes.
And then they would allow them to coexist within the territory.
And even before, as they were getting ready to invade and go forth, the leaders of the people would then wind up intermarrying. And so I love this point in that I used to have one of our church leaders would often refer to that change in leadership, from Moses to Joshua. But if you look at that portion of Scripture, one of the last things that Moses ordered was that for all the leaders of the people to be hanged. He hung them because they had done what? They had intermarried. Okay? And when you get the leaders of the people outwardly defying God, the leaders of the different tribes, the same ones who are leading their people to faithfulness in this portion, were leading their people into idolatry elsewhere. Okay? And you can tell that Joshua probably had a fresh start, because there was a whole new crop of leaders who just watched their fathers or their grandfathers be executed for these sins, breaking of God's law.
One of those areas where human understanding, we can't comprehend what God's intent was. I mean, you can see the intermarriage and how that turned out, but do the ends always justify the means? You know, can Israel today say, well, what we need to do is annihilate all the Palestinians and that way we won't have a problem?
Well,
you know, God could have turned them like he did Nineveh. He could have turned all those people to believe in him, but he chose the path of annihilation. And we don't understand why.
Well, we're okay with it, I think, Bob, as long as God is the one that does it. All right, I don't see too many Christians who are squeamish that God rained down fire and brimstone on the cities of Sodom and Gomorrah, right? And wiped them all out. Because who's doing that? God's doing that, right? The same thing, was there anything left of the people, the men, the women, the children, the herds? And the answer is no, they were absolutely obliterated. And I don't find many Christians who have an issue with that. But when God uses his own people to enact the same judgment, as opposed to just raining down fire, then we start to get a little uncomfortable. Okay, but it's the same thing that God, we fully agree that God is a God of means, right? That he works through things. We have means of grace. He works through the waters of holy baptism. He works through the bread and the wine of Holy Communion. He's a God of means. He often works through the church and through his people, right? God worked through another human being to bring you to faith, did he not? It could have been a parent, it could have been a sibling, it could have been a friend. We all have different stories, but God worked through people to get you here to where you are in your faith. And so in the same way, God is casting judgment upon these folks. Remember the Baals that they worshiped and Moloch that they worshiped. These were not kind gods, right? The contrast is, of course, that the people who worshiped those gods had to do what? Sacrifice their sons to that god. And of course, apropos on Holy Week, where we learn that the true God does what? Sacrifices his son for the people. And so we give the right of judgment to God. Scripture clearly says that this is the domain, the realm of God, and he can judge. And of course, because the people didn't like it, either their greed got the better of them, that, hey, this Canaanite woman is prettier than any of the other Jewish gals that are in my tribe. Why not just marry her? Or she didn't grow up with me and doesn't know what a klutz I am, and I have a fresh start with her. Okay. Whatever it might be. And why do I want to spend years building up my flock when, hey, that one right there is a nice looking flock, and I can just take over that one? And of course, we have the benefit of hindsight, right? In that we know how this turned out, in that this idolatry plagued them for the rest of their existence. All right. It still does. Yep. Wow, we did not leave off in a very convenient spot. Real quick before I wrap up. So obviously no Bible class next Sunday. We're all going to go down and eat. And then after that, we've got a unified service. What do we normally do for Bible class on the unified service? Do we just skip it? All right. That makes sense. Okay. So then I'll really have no clue where we left off when we get together in 3 weeks. All right. Yeah, we read part of the way. Who knows? How big of a deal is confirmation?